Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the webinar about managing Active Directory change. On the line, we're very happy to have Darren Mar-Elia, Microsoft MVP and the head of product at Semperis, who will expand about the topic, show demos, etc., on how to maintain best practices on Active Directory change management. Just as an FYI, we are recording today's presentation, so if you need to review demos or share with friends later on, you will be able to do so. And of course, if you have any questions for Darren, please feel free to post them using the webinar question tool, and we will answer them during the Q&A at the end. With that, I'm going to pass it on to Darren to start this presentation.
Thanks, Maytal, and thanks everyone for joining today. I'm happy to be presenting this particular topic on managing AD change. We'll dispense with some of the logistics. That's me, as Maytal mentioned, head of product here at Semperis, and Microsoft MVP for many years. A little bit about Semperis. We are about Active Directory identity protection and recovery. Most notably, we have the State Manager and Forced Recovery products, which I'll talk a little bit more about at the end of this talk. And it's really geared towards, taking Active Directory protection and recovery to the next level. And I think it's most relevant in this day and age where most organizations are relying on AD for, well, an awful lot of stuff related to their internal workings, everything from desktop logon to application authentication and authorization. So we're serious about making sure that AD remains highly available and highly protected in your environment. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Before I get started, I want to make a plug for the HIP conference, Hybrid Identity Protection Conference, that we're having here at the beginning of November in New York City. And if you remember the old Directory Experts Conference, we really trying to emulate that, the spirit of that show and the sort of updated for the modern era, but sort of the focus around Microsoft identity solutions. And we've even got a lot of the old speakers from the DEC conferences to join us to present topics on everything related to AD and Azure AD and just in identity in the enterprise and this sort of current challenge that we're all living in around hybrid identity. And in fact, I'm really happy that Gil Kirkpatrick, who was the CTO at NetPro in the old days and was sort of the father of DEC, is going to be presenting at the HIP conference. So if you get a chance, if you have some training budget left over, this is definitely a show to see if you're in the Microsoft identity space, and we hope you can make it. So quick poll question. Maytal will throw up the poll. Just want to get a sense of what people are doing with respect to AD change today.
Thank you, Darren. So a quick poll question to you just to get your opinion and past experience. Have you ever encountered a situation where changes were made by users in Active Directory and ended up causing problems? And we'll wait, we'll give it a couple more seconds as people start responding. And we'll give it, I think, almost all of you responded by now. That was very fast. Great, and I just want to share the results with you. So I'm going to close the poll in just 1 second. And I just want to share with you the results are overwhelming but not surprising, I guess, Darren. At 75% of our attendees are saying that they did see changes in Active Directory cause problems. About 6% of our attendees are saying that they didn't, but they are aware that it could happen, and about 20% say that they are not sure.
Yep.
I'm going to pass it on to you.
Yeah, so that doesn't surprise me. Anyone that's worked in AD for a while has seen issues come up around changes related to AD. And if I throw my good friend group policy into the mix, that number probably goes to 99.9999 because there's so many situations that I've come across where changes to group policy have caused untold misery in environments. Okay, so let's dive in a little bit and talk about this thing of AD change. So why do we care about AD change? As I mentioned earlier, AD is kind of the fundamental backbone for authentication and authorization in most organizations. Back when AD first came out, really it was about how do I log into my desktop system, how do I log into my servers and access files and printers and things like that. But the use of AD has grown dramatically over the last 17 years that AD has been out in the wild, and I think it's fair to say that in most larger organizations there is everything from SSO for SaaS applications that eventually come back to do authentication and authorization to AD, to integration with Azure AD for Office 365, to numerous internal applications and systems that may be using LDAP for authentication and authorization, Linux boxes that are authenticating to AD to log onto the console or to do SSH. So lots and lots of stuff now relies on AD. But fundamentally, AD itself hasn't really changed all that much in 17 years. And another reason we obviously care is because, again, it's gone from being this, oh, well, if AD is down or unavailable or somebody made a change that we didn't like, then maybe you can't log into your workstation, or maybe, new people can't log onto their workstations, but, people that are already logged in are fine. And now it's, my Salesforce access is down, my, Concur or Workday access is down, my mission critical line of business app that uses AD is down or unavailable. So, the whole enterprise really has come to depend on AD as being sort of the identity backbone of choice. And, the practices around managing AD, frankly, haven't changed all that much, and AD was born out of a very granular security model, but the management or administration of AD usually falls on many hands. So there's many hands in the pie, there's many hands touching AD objects. If you've had an AD in place for a while, the delegation that you've used in AD may not be optimal, so many people may have access to objects that they shouldn't. So you've got that you're dealing with. So, coming back to the question, why do we care about AD change? It really does get down to how do we manage change in an environment where there are many people and many applications reliant on it. And then, the standards vary in terms of the quality of the data that goes into AD. And what I mean by that is many organizations have developed inconsistent processes over time. Maybe you have a third-party tool where all critical AD changes go through that tool, and there's some templates around it and some business logic that ensures that the department codes are entered consistently or the group memberships are entered consistently. But that varies a lot in many organizations, even organizations that do have tools. So if you're not using the tool, or if you're making changes to objects outside of the normal objects that are managed by the tool, if you have a provisioning solution for users and groups versus not, all of those things really affect the quality of the data going into AD. And I like to think about, and frankly, because it is, AD is a giant database, right? And so the same rules that apply to any mission-critical database in your organization in terms of data quality, in terms of who can make changes to the data and what changes are allowed, those all apply to AD, but many organizations just don't think of AD that way. And I completely understand that because of the legacy of AD as sort of a network operating system directory that grew up out of NT4 and NetWare and those sorts of technologies. But now that it's become sort of this mission critical thing, and that's not a recent phenomenon, it's been going on for years now, all of these best practices around change and data quality really need to be in place in order to properly manage AD and ensure that it's safe and secure and doing the job that it's supposed to do and highly available and all that. So let's talk about change in AD. So change is happening all the time. So doesn't matter what the change is, whether it's users initiating changes like password changes or updating their phone number if you give them that access right, to administrators making changes, to provisioning solutions making changes. All of these things, amount to change happening on almost a constant basis in AD. It really depends on how big your organization is, what your rate of change is. But for sure, we see in even large organizations a fairly consistent rate of change of any number of maybe 5, 10, 15, 20 changes a second, where that in a large organization that might be just normal. Most of those changes are not monitored, and what I mean by that is no one is looking at and paying attention to those changes in anything close to real time. Some of that is the practicality of the situation. How do you monitor that much change in real time? But also part of it is the discoverability of the data. So if you're relying, for example, on audit logs may be collected off of each of your DCs by some sort of audit agent or SIEM solution and being sent up to a central database, and they have to be ingested and indexed, and maybe they'll get there eventually and maybe they won't, and maybe the information in there is discoverable, meaning that it's in plain English and you can understand what the change was, or maybe it's not, depending on the security event that's getting thrown. So those are just sort of the realities of thinking about changes in Active Directory. And then usually only those, like sort of what people consider to be critical AD infrastructure changes are subject to change control. So, I mean, I'm sure if I ask the question, how many of you open a change ticket whenever you add a user to a group or change the user's department field? None of you are going to answer that, and it's the normal way we think about AD. We're certainly going to open a change ticket if we're going to patch a bunch of servers or update servers or install a new application on servers, but we're not going to open a change ticket for simple AD changes. Now, we might open a change ticket to create a bunch of new subnet objects that could affect replication or new site topology or new DNS zones. Those kinds of bigger infrastructure changes are often subject to change control, but the day-to-day stuff just isn't, and for practical reasons I think that's the case. Now, I would argue that there are probably some non-infrastructure related AD changes that should be subject to change control. For example, privileged access changes that change who has privileged access in the environment. But even those are often not. And companies have come up with solutions over the years to try to figure out how to essentially work around that, or at least be aware of it when it happens. If somebody gets added to the domain admins group, they get notified or something like that. But those kinds of changes probably should be subject to change control. And then, just in general, all of these changes have the ability to cause problems. Now, the problems can range from basically your AD becoming unavailable to, even more nefarious problems. So I think when we're thinking about change in AD, you sort of have to weigh the risks versus the rewards of implementing more stringent change control. So some examples of the kinds of changes that we see and the kinds of things that you have to think about: routine changes like those password resets, the attribute updates, the group membership changes, the distribution list changes, to privileged access stuff, so adding users to privileged access groups, to infrastructure changes like DNS or replication topology. And then finally, AD delegation changes. This is one that we don't necessarily think about, but in today's world of AD being used as a target for information for attackers that are looking to move laterally around a network, AD is kind of this treasure trove of important information. Between AD and group policy, somebody with access to AD objects, group memberships, GPOs, can really draw a map of where privileged access is granted and to whom. So when we think about AD delegation, who has access to what, that's an important category of change that we should be thinking about with respect to AD change management. Okay, moving on. Opportunities for disaster. This is the good stuff. How can we cause grief for our Active Directory? Well, there's lots and lots of ways for this to happen. Poorly written scripts that modify the wrong objects or attributes. I can't tell you how many times I've come across scenarios where an admin has written a script thinking they were doing one thing, not adequately testing it. Part of that reason is they may not have an adequate test environment. If I asked you out there, how many of you had a Active Directory test environment that mimics production and stays synchronized with production? My guess is that only a fraction of you would answer that positively. So, oftentimes production AD is used as the test bed for these scripts. And so when that happens, you sort of have to react to the problems that causes. And the modification of objects or attributes is probably the least of your problems. If an OU with 15,000 user objects was deleted, there's going to be a lot of fallout from something like that. Accidental deletion of large numbers of objects. So I just gave myself an entree into that subject. So that AD has done a much better job with the protect accidental deletion flag on OUs and Active Directory users and computers, where you can protect objects like OUs or users and groups from being accidentally deleted. But this can still happen inadvertently or otherwise, and so the ability to recover from that in a quick and timely manner is super critical. Malicious targeting of domain controllers. We saw with the I think it was the NotPetya ransomware that was specifically looking for domain controllers in the code that was going out and looking at places to encrypt. And if you had all of your domain controllers encrypted by some ransomware that was running around your network, that's not a great recipe for having a high availability Active Directory. So that I think increasingly I'm seeing, and I think we're seeing in general, attackers looking at Active Directory as a potential target for both information exposure, information retrieval, as well as potentially crippling organizations. So infrastructure changes that render AD non-functional, accidentally wiping out site links or subnet objects or site objects or AD objects in the configuration naming context. There's a bunch of stuff in the config naming context that you can do that is unpleasant to Active Directory. DNS-related failures. Somebody accidentally deletes a bunch of SRV records and suddenly DCs are not discoverable, or they delete a whole zone. That kind of stuff. DNS is, as we know, is sort of mission critical for AD being healthy and functional and doing what it's supposed to do. And then misconfigured GPO changes. So this is one that's of course near and dear to my heart. I have lots of examples over the last 17, 18 years of group policy rendering an organization completely non-functional. The biggest one I saw was a GPO that was linked at the domain level, but that was relying on security group filtering to target only a subset of users. And somebody had set a deny logon locally user right as a test on that GPO, but forgot to replace the security group filter. And everyone received that policy and came in the morning and couldn't log on to their workstations. So that was a multi-thousand person company that had to scramble to undo that. So there's a lot of opportunity in Active Directory land to cause pain. So we've got another quick poll. Maytal could throw that up and we get a little bit more information about some of your experiences in this area.
Thanks, Darren. And the question is, do you put any kind of change control around your Active Directory changes? And the possible answers are no, only for key infrastructure changes, or we have a product that manages Active Directory changes completely. And we'll give it a couple more seconds because I'm noticing people are still responding. Perfect. 5 more seconds and we're going to close the poll, and I'm going to share the results with you. And so to summarize what you guys responded, about 30%, around a third of you do not have anything to control Active Directory changes at the moment. About 50% only emphasize infrastructure changes, and about 20% of you have products that manage AD changes completely. Darren, any comments about these responses?
I mean, I think that's consistent with what I've seen. You know, I'm actually a little surprised that the nothing around change management number is as big as it is, but I think that's also probably a function of how folks think about AD, and you know, I think it's only become obvious to me, I would say, in the last, let's say 2 to 3 years, that as AD's stature has grown in the organization, so too has the need for really thinking about change differently. And so I guess it's not surprising to me that that number is still fairly large.
It could also be the reason why we have so many attendees, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's an interesting topic that that folks, you know, need to think about on top of all the other things that they have to worry about. I spent 30 years in IT, so I'm well aware of the not enough time to handle all the problems scenario. So, you know, you sort of can do only what you can do. All right, cool. Let's go on. So let me move to the next topic. So techniques for mitigating change impact. So there's lots of ways that you can skin this cat. There's invasive ways, like make every non-initiated change subject, non-user initiated change subject to a change control ticket. I don't think most shops are going to do that unless you're in a highly regulated, highly secure environment. You know, things like group changes or attribute changes, or those kinds of things. They're not. You'd be buried in paperwork trying to do change tickets on everything. You may want to increase the number of things that are subject to change ticket, but by and large, this one is probably tough for most shops. All changes must be tested in a lab environment. Where I have seen this work is for any significant I would say infrastructure changes to AD or any significant structural changes to AD, and that includes things like, you know, maybe updates to domain functional levels, schema updates, you know, doing GPO, you know, large-scale GPO changes or reorganizations, doing OU reorganizations, all of those things. And especially if you're scripting those or automating those, all of those things should be tested in a lab environment that looks as close to production as possible. So that's one, you know, at least not super invasive way of mitigating change impact. And then, of course, having changes go through an approval process. And this sort of goes hand in hand with the change ticket, but you don't necessarily need to have a change ticket for certain critical changes. So you might decide, for example, that all changes of a certain class need to be approved by a manager or the manager of the particular owner of the objects or something like that. So something a little less than a change ticket for everything, but a little bit more than, you know, just opening up 80 users and computers and pressing OK. And then there's the not so invasive stuff that I think you know, is probably good for most shops, at least helpful for most shops in terms of how they manage change. So things like key infrastructure changes being subject to change control. So anytime you're doing something that could impact the health and stability of AD, you know, whether it's running an automated script to update 1,000 objects, or making a GPO change, or, you know, doing a domain functional level update or a schema update, all of those things should be subject to your normal change control procedures, which often include many of those items that I listed on the left. So, testing in a pre-production environment, having an approval process, having a change ticket, etc. And then, having normal non-user initiated changes tracked and available for reversal. And what do I mean by this? So, there's ways that you can reverse changes, whether it's the AD recycle bin that allows you to undelete objects that have been deleted, or products like our Semperis State Manager that allow you to track changes and then undo them if needed. And then privileged related change. So privilege related changes should go through some kind of approval process, or if you have a provisioning solution in place, there's sort of an implied workflow in those products typically that allows you to control who's getting access to privileges, privileged groups, or privileged rights within your environment. So I think those are good, not so invasive steps that you can go through to sort of help make this this AD change process a little less impactful to your environment. All right, so what I want to do now is show a little bit about how Semperis can help with AD change. And what I'm going to do is just kind of walk through a couple slides and then drop into a demo, which I think is always more interesting. So the Semperis AD State Manager product, we do real-time tracking of AD changes and are able to correlate, so who made the change with what the change was. You can do searches of changes, you can do comparisons, you can do real-time restoration of objects and attributes. So in terms of managing that change life cycle I just talked about, we really can give you sort of a, I like to call it a change log, an active real-time change log of what's going on within group policy with the ability to revert that. So how do we compare to, other ways of doing this? So, the ability to track modifications, the ability to do object and attribute restoration, the ability to do that on DNS and configuration naming contexts as well, the ability to recover deleted items. So if you're using native tools, you don't get a lot of this out of the native tools, but for sure with our Active Directory State Manager, we cover most of those scenarios, if not all of those scenarios. And then, if, heaven forbid, something goes horribly wrong with your Active Directory, we have the ability to actually do a fully automated full forest recovery of your Active Directory. So if you're used to the native way, which is the Microsoft 87-page white paper that takes you through a lot of manual steps and a lot of manual prep that could take hours or days depending on the size of your environment, we've basically automated that process to make it as quick and efficient as possible without the need for any manual intervention. So that's the forest recovery. So let me dive into a demo now. And I'm just going to pop out of my slideshow mode and drop into ADSM, and it's probably logged me out because I wasn't active. So let me go ahead and log back in. So what you see on the screen is the Active Directory State Manager, and what I have here is a dashboard of kind of the health of my State Manager environment, the sort of change trends, changes and deleted items of my Active Directory over time, and then recent changes that might have happened in the environment. I don't have any recent changes, but I'm going to go ahead and drop into the change view, and what you'll see here is I've got a number of entries in this list that show me in real time the changes that are happening to AD. So I've got a bunch of changes that happened to some user objects, and if I expand one of these, you'll see kind of the data that we provide. So I've got this modification operation on this user object, Wendy, and her department attribute was changed from purchasing to oops. and it was done by Joe Helpdesk. So what happened here? Well, it looks like Joe Helpdesk, if I look at sort of the trend here, looks like Joe Helpdesk ran a script that set a bunch of objects to an incorrect value. So what I can do is I can come in here, copy Joe Helpdesk, come up to my search filter, and say I want to search on all changes made by Joe Helpdesk today, and I want to do it for user objects, and just for the attribute department, and I'm going to go ahead and run that search. And now you see all of these changes that were made by my particular user. I'm going to go ahead and expand the list so that I can see all of them. And there we go. So I've got 50 some odd users that were unfortunately changed by Joe Helpdesk using some script that he ran. So I'm going to go ahead and select all of them and say undo selected. And now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and undo that mistake that Joe Helpdesk just made. So we've got these jobs running that are going ahead and undoing those changes that have happened to all of those user objects that script ran. Now while that's going on, let me show you a little bit about some of the other parts of the product. So I've got deleted items. So this is your normal, I've got an object that was deleted, I want to restore it. This works for either individual objects, or if I had an OU that was deleted that contained a bunch of sub-OUs and a bunch of sub-user objects, I could restore those as well. I've got configuration partitions changes, so I can see, in this case, a subnet was added. I've got deletions of subnets. I could undo those. I could restore this deleted object, this deleted subnet. So I've got all kinds of changes showing in the configuration naming context. DNS changes, if I come in here and change to a different zone, I can see CNAMEs that were modified, and I can go ahead and undo those changes. So we also, what's useful about this is we also decode the binary blob that's stored in Active Directory integrated DNS, so you can actually see the data within the record, and rather than just seeing that something changed in that. And then of course my favorite, group policy changes. So I can come in here to a group policy change, and I can compare what's changed between the time that the current GPO and the previous backup that we held. So we keep backups of GPOs automatically, and then we can go in and we can annotate a GPMC settings report to show what's actually changed in that GPO. And then I can, based on that, I can actually restore the GPO from backup. And I also have the option of restoring a GPO from a GPO, the links on the GPO in addition to the settings themselves. So let's go ahead and look at my jobs and see that all of my user objects that I had originally, that Joe Helpdesk had originally reverted, are now restored. You can see that the the change log's been updated to show that oops has been replaced with their original value. So I just very quickly and easily undid a potentially damaging mistake that my helpdesk scripter ran, and it allows me to really quickly and easily get back to a well-known state. Because we're keeping the state of Active Directory within the product, we don't rely on. So let me talk a little bit about the architecture and how we do what we do. So unlike other products that just rely on the Windows security event log on domain controllers to figure out what has changed, we actually collect the replication information from the domain controller where our agent is located to tell us what the most recent changes were since the last replication cycle. So we use the same information that DCs use to communicate with each other to get replication changes, to get changes that are happening to AD. We're then able to correlate those back to the security event log for a given change so that we can, in this changed by column here, we can get the actual person that made the change. So this information up here comes from Active Directory directly. We don't rely on security event logs for that. This information is collected and then correlated back to the change using the Windows security event logs on the DCs. So we're able to see and we're able to survive any kinds of issues with agents going down or DCs becoming non-responsive. We know what the last change is that we received. We keep a bookmark, if you will, of the last change. And so if the agent were down during a change and came back up, we would see the history of that change. We would see all the changes that had happened since the last time. So if you happen to be patching a DC when a change was made, we would still be able to see that change. So that gives you a little bit of a taste of the State Manager. So State Manager has that ability to, and here you see that there's my recent feed, so I can get a real-time view of what's going on in my Active Directory and then act on it if I need to. Now let me spend a brief moment showing you the Active Directory Forest Recovery product. Forest Recovery is one of those products that you hope you never have to use, but if you do, you need something that you need to be able to show that you have some way of recovering your Active Directory from a total disaster. And a total disaster doesn't have to be a complete meltdown of your entire infrastructure. In other words, you know, it doesn't have to be a non-Petya or something like that. It could be something as simple as somebody just did a mass deletion, either on purpose or accidentally, of an entire domain, and you need to be able to recover that quickly. And other means of doing that, you know, if it was a really destructive deletion, then your fastest solution might actually be a domain or forest recovery. So if you are in a state of having to do a forest recovery, it's really as simple as choosing a backup. We'll show you the domain controllers that we have the backups for, and the product manages the backups, creates the backups, manages the backup schedule, manages how you back up your DCs. We ensure that you have sufficient backups to recover the whole forest. So in this case, I have at least one DC with backups in each of my 3 domains in this forest. And then we'll actually analyze the backups that we have to see what steps we need to take to do that full forest recovery. And you'll see here that I've got restore from backup for these first 2 DCs in this root domain. For this one, I don't have a backup, so I'm going to do a repromotion. So I'll manage that automatically, that DC repromotion process. Similarly, for this domain, I have, let's see if I can get that to expand out. There we go. I have the ability to either restore from backup or repromote, and the same for my 3rd domain. So I've got, in this particular domain, I have 1 DC that I can restore from backup and 2 DCs that I'll end up repromoting. So the point is, if I press this recover button, my entire forest will be recovered. Depending on the size of your forest, the dispersion of your domain controllers, etc., in a matter of minutes or hours rather than days or potentially longer. So that is the AD Forest Recovery product. Now I'm going to go back to my slides. And take some time for questions. If you have questions about the products, I'm happy to answer those, or you can always reach out to us from our website, and there's a contact page on the website you can ask questions of. And Maytal, maybe you can help me out with questions, because I'm not sure I can see the question panel.
Yep, so we did have a couple of questions come in from the audience. The first question that came in regarding the State Manager while you were doing the demo, can the State Manager product revert password changes as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. We can, in fact, revert password changes. So that's a feature that we added recently, and that we do have the ability to essentially revert a change to a password. So if you had a service account that somebody accidentally changed the password on and it broke a bunch of applications, we have that ability to revert passwords right from the state manager interface, just as you saw me do the undo on individual objects. So that's a good question.
Great. And another question that came in is, how far back does the Semperis product back up the Active Directory?
So I'll talk about both products in the context of how each of them works. So you can specify, with Active Directory State Manager, you can specify how long you want to keep change data. So typically what folks will do is they'll keep change data from whatever their tombstone lifetime is. But it really just depends on the rate of change in your environment, the amount of data in your Active Directory, and how big of a database you want to keep. So we're keeping this, unlike other products, we're not making backups that you have to mount in order to see those changes in real time. We are actually, as I said, we're grabbing those changes as they replicate from the AD domain controllers and storing them in our data store and keeping them locally so that we can keep that history of state across all objects over time. And we do it in a very efficient way, so we're not keeping a lot of duplicate information around how that state is held and stored. So with respect to the state manager, you can decide how long you want to keep the data. With respect to the Active Directory Forest Recovery product, you set the schedule and the number of backups that you want to keep for a given set of DCs, and you can have different schedules for different DCs. So you're able to essentially control not only how many backups you keep, where they're kept, but also how long they're kept. Good question. Thank you.
Thank you, Darren. The next question that came up is, can you explain how the State Manager product knows when changes happen in Active Directory?
Yeah, I mean, without getting into too many gruesome details, Active Directory domain controllers are, the way they replicate is that they themselves know when changes are happening. So when a replication cycle comes up, they keep if you will, an update sequence number is one of the pieces of information that we'll use, and we'll essentially know the last set of changes that we received from that domain controller. So this is how Active Directory domain controllers themselves replicate and converge across an entire infrastructure. So every DC sends the list of its changes to its partner DCs, and then they send it along, etc. So eventually all DCs replicate and converge into having a consistent state of information. So we're using that same mechanism to figure out what the last change was that we saw, and what and then getting all changes since then. Hopefully that basically describes it.
Thanks. Another question is actually related to GPO from when you demoed about the GPO bits. If GPOs are managed by AGPM, does this product work with AGPM by checking out the GPO, restoring it, checking it back, and deploying?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. AGPM, there's multiple ways of doing group policy change control, AGPM just being one of them, and that's a product from Microsoft. The way that product works is when you check out a GPO, you're essentially making a copy of it in your Active Directory. It shows up in GPMC as kind of this funny GUID named thing. You make your change to that, and then when the change is approved and checked back in for production or deployed, it's basically overwriting the existing GPO. We don't do anything special to see those AGPM specific operations. We will see it as the discrete group policy operations that they are, which is to say that when the temporary GPO gets created, we will see that as a creation event by the AGPM service account, and then when it's checked back in, we'll see it as a essentially as an AD change by the AGPM service account. So we will see the service account making the change, and we will provide the ability to actually filter out events based on, for example, who made the change. So you could potentially filter out those changes so that you could see any changes that were made to GP that weren't made by that AGPM service account. But that's as close as we get to being sort of AGPM aware.
Thank you,
Good
Darren.
question. Yep.
Another good question I think that came in from our audience is, you demonstrated what could be done in the case of total failure, and attendees would like to know, how do you authenticate to the Semperis server without Active Directory being active at the moment, and how do your backups get restored out of the failed domain controllers if the domain controllers are not functional?
Yeah, absolutely. So not surprisingly, that ADFR server that I logged into is not a member of a domain. It is a member of it is a member server essentially that's not a member of the domain. When you set up the product, you set a recovery account and password, and that is what's used to authenticate to the recovery panel. Now, the authentication between the ADFR server and the agents that we deploy on the servers to be recovered is also not relying on Active Directory authentication, of course, because we can't rely on AD being around. So we use certificate-based authentication to communicate between the ADFR server and the ADFR agents on those servers. And the agents are the things that are responsible for doing the actual recovery steps. So whether it's grabbing the backup locally or from the ADFR server, or doing a re-DC promo of the servers, or doing metadata cleanup, which we do as a function of so once the environment is made live again, if there are DCs that don't exist anymore, if there are changes to DCs in terms of where they exist or their roles, we will do the metadata cleanup, we'll do the DNS cleanup. So we'll make sure everything is functional from an infrastructure perspective before we say we're done with the recovery. All of that is done using the agents that are placed on the servers that you're going to be recovering to. So hopefully that answers that question about authentication.
Thanks. And another question that came up is, what are the required resources of the VM console, so if somebody's using virtual machines?
I'm not sure I understand the question exactly, but we can get information. If you send us a contact note from our website, we can get you the requirements for each of the products. You know, the CPU, RAM, disk space, all that fun stuff that you typically want to know about a product. I mean, in general, the server-side consoles, I like to configure them with 4 gig of RAM at least, and if they're accessing a database, if it's a shared SQL Server database, we have some space calculations you can use for that, or it just depends on a lot of factors, but we'd be happy to get you that information.
Thanks. Another question that came in, can you restore DCs to an offline lab environment for testing changes with live data?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a scenario that we support with the Active Directory Forest Recovery product. So you can export so you've got your AD Forest Recovery server set up and backing up your DCs. You can export its configuration and take the backups and put them in an offline lab environment, rebuild your ADFR server, and essentially do a forest recovery to the lab environment of the new or of your production forest, and it will essentially look and smell and act like your production forest, but obviously needs to be isolated because all the names and IPs and all that will be the same.
Thank you. With that, Darren, I would like to wrap things up because it seems like we're just about out of time and the questions are winding down. And if you have any questions following this webinar, we will be able to answer them offline. So please don't hesitate to shoot us an email and ask whatever technical questions you want, and we'll be happy to connect you with Darren. And like we said before, this session was recorded, and I will be in touch within the next week to provide you with a link to the recording so you could review this session. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and thank you so much, Darren, for a great presentation today.
Thank you.